The Galactic Council tried to limit humanity's voice. Instead, Earth began preparing for independence. The notification arrived at 3:47 Universal Time Coordinated on a Tuesday. Ambassador Priya Vasanthakumar was asleep in her quarters aboard the Meridian Station, the joint species diplomatic hub orbiting at the Earth-Sun L2 point, when her implant pulsed 3 times in the specific rhythm reserved for Galactic Council communications. She had learned, over 4 years of service, to distinguish that rhythm from the softer ones. 3 pulses meant official. 3 pulses meant someone had decided something without asking her first. She sat up, pulled her tablet from the bedside cradle and read. Galactic Council Directive 7-441C, Provisional Restructuring of Assembly Representation. Effective from the next standard cycle, member civilizations classified under Tier 3 designation will transition from full voting status to advisory observer status. This restructuring reflects the Council's commitment to efficient deliberative processes. Tier 3 civilizations retain all advisory privileges including the right to submit formal petitions. This directive applies to Humanity, Sol 3, the Keth Collective, the Amari Confederacy, and the Velundi Aggregates. She read it 3 times. Then she set the tablet down and stared at the ceiling for a long moment. Advisory observer. She had spent 11 years learning the diplomatic language of 6 alien species. She knew what words meant in the spaces between them. Advisory observer meant you could speak, but no one was obligated to listen. It meant your vote. The vote that humanity had earned through 40 years of careful, deliberate, sometimes painful engagement with the wider galactic community, was being taken off the table. She opened a channel to her deputy, a young man named Tariq Osei who had been awake already, because Tariq was always awake. "You've seen it," he said. It wasn't a question. "I've seen it. I've been pulling the background communications. The directive was drafted 6 weeks ago. It went through 3 council subcommittees. Nobody told us. Nobody told any of the Tier 3 civilizations," Priya said. "That's not an accident." There was a pause. Through the small viewport beside her bunk, she could see the faint smear of the Milky Way's core. It always looked beautiful from out here. She had once found that comforting. "What do we do?" Tariq asked. She thought about that for a moment. The honest answer was that she didn't know yet, not because she lacked ideas, but because she needed to understand exactly what had been done before she decided how to respond to it. Reacting without understanding was how civilizations made expensive mistakes. "Send the full text to Geneva and to all mission heads," she said. "Flag it as urgent but not emergency. I don't want anyone making statements before we've had time to read it properly. And get me a call with Secretary General Okafor in 4 hours." "Understood. Ambassador, what does Tier 3 even mean?" "I looked it up and the Council's own classification framework it's not clearly defined." "That," she said, "is precisely the problem. The Council's classification system had always been opaque. Humanity had known this for decades. When first contact had come, not with a dramatic arrival, but with a carefully encoded signal received by a radio telescope array in New Mexico and decoded over the better part of 3 years, the subsequent diplomatic engagement had been cautious, professional, and deeply confusing. The Galactic Council was not a government. It was closer to a parliament of very old nations who had agreed long ago on certain rules of engagement, and who had been adding amendments to those rules for so long that the original document was almost unrecognizable. There were 17 member civilizations. Humanity was the newest. There were also, apparently, tiers. The tiering system had been explained to humanity's first contact teams as a framework for graduated integration, a way of acknowledging that a species 50 years into interstellar engagement had different needs and capacities than one that had been part of the community for 4,000 years. It had seemed reasonable at the time. In retrospect, Priya thought, it had been the kind of explanation that sounds reasonable precisely because you don't yet know what questions to ask. She had been asking better questions for the past 4 years. The Velhari, the oldest member civilization, the ones who had first organized the Council in any recognizable form, had never been shy about their belief that younger species needed guidance. They framed it as stewardship. They framed a lot of things as stewardship. What it meant in practice was that Tier 1 civilizations, of which there were 3, held permanent seats on the Council's executive body. Tier 2 civilizations, of which there were 6, held rotating seats. Tier 3 civilizations, humanity and 3 others, all relatively recent members, had full voting rights in the General Assembly, which was the democratic heart of the organization. At past tense as of this morning, Priya dressed, walked to the small galley down the corridor, made coffee with the unhurried attention of someone who had learned that rushing through small tasks didn't actually save meaningful time, and thought about what she knew. She knew that Directive 7-441C had been drafted without consulting the affected civilizations. She knew it had passed through subcommittees without the kind of debate that would normally accompany a structural change to fundamental voting rights. She knew that the timing was not coincidental. 3 months ago, the Tier 3 bloc had voted together to reject a proposed trade framework that would have benefited Tier 1 civilizations disproportionately. The vote had been close. It had surprised people. And she knew, from 4 years of watching how the Council actually worked rather than how it said it worked, that the Velhari and their closest partners had never quite believed that Tier 3 civilizations would exercise their votes in ways that created friction. They thought we would observe and defer, she thought. They thought we would be grateful for the seat. She finished her coffee. Then she opened her tablet and began drafting a very careful, very precise response. Not an outraged response. Not a wounded one. Those would be satisfying to write, but satisfaction was not the goal. The goal was clarity. 4 hours later, she was on a secure call with Secretary-General Amara Okafor in Geneva, along with the heads of humanities diplomatic missions to the 4 largest council members. It was the middle of the night in Geneva. Okafor had the alert, assembled look of someone who had been awake for hours and had decided not to mention it. "I've read your analysis," Okafor said. "I've also had calls from the Keth and the Amari. They're furious." "They should be," Priya said. "But I'd encourage them not to express that publicly yet." "What's your read?" Priya chose her words carefully. The council made a calculation. They calculated that the Tier 3 bloc had become inconvenient, and that the most efficient way to address that inconvenience was to reclassify it. They didn't consult us because they didn't think consultation was necessary, because in their model, we would accept this the way we've accepted other things, with some formal protest that would eventually subside. She paused. "I think they may have miscalculated. What do we do about it?" This was Commander Feliz Aldana from the Mars Coordination Office. He had a direct manner that Priya appreciated. "We file a formal objection," she said. "Carefully, correctly, through every procedural channel available to us. We do this not because we expect the Council to reverse the directive immediately, but because we want a clear record of exactly what we said and when we said it." She looked around the assembled faces on her screen. "And while we're doing that, quietly, without announcement, we start asking different questions." "Such as?" Okafor asked. "Such as, what do we actually need from the Council and what do we provide to it? What are the terms of our membership, and are those terms being honored? What does genuine representation look like for humanity, and is that something this institution is capable of providing?" She paused again. "I'm not suggesting anything dramatic. I'm suggesting that a mature civilization, when it discovers that a relationship was built on assumptions that turn out to be false, takes a clear-eyed look at that relationship." There was a silence on the call. "That's a significant thing to be suggesting," Okafor said quietly. "Yes," Priya agreed. "It is." Outside her viewport, the stars continued their ancient, indifferent turning. Humanity had spent 40 years learning to speak the language of those who lived among them. It was beginning, Priya thought, to understand that language well enough to hear what was not being said. That was the beginning of something. She wasn't certain yet what. The formal objection took 12 days to prepare. This was not because the drafting was difficult. Priya had written more complex documents in less time, but because humanity's legal team insisted on something that the Council's procedural framework did not technically require: a complete evidentiary annex. The annex ran to 431 pages. Dr. Yemi Adesanya, the lead legal architect of the objection and a woman who had spent 20 years specializing in emerging frameworks of interstellar governance, explained the reasoning simply: "If they're going to dismiss it, I want them to have to dismiss 431 pages of specific, sourced, documented record. I want there to be no comfortable ambiguity about what was said, what was done, and what it means." Priya had read the annex twice. It was methodical in a way that was almost hypnotic. It began with the original terms of humanity's membership application, including specific language about the rights and responsibilities of full member civilizations, and traced every subsequent Council directive, amendment, and interpretive ruling that had modified, qualified, or quietly shifted those terms over 40 years. It documented 12 separate instances in which Council subcommittees had made decisions affecting Tier 3 civilizations without prior consultation. It included the full deliberative record of the 6 weeks during which Directive 7-441C had been developed, compared it against the Council's own stated requirements for major structural changes, and identified 7 specific procedural violations. The annex did not use inflammatory language. It did not characterize intent. It simply recorded what had happened, in sequence with citations. Reading it felt like watching a careful geologist core sample a hillside and discover that the beautiful stable-looking terrain was, layer by layer, built on something other than what the surveyors had claimed. The formal objection was filed on a Thursday morning, transmitted simultaneously to the Council Secretariat, the Velhari diplomatic mission, and the representatives of the 12 other member civilizations. Priya delivered a brief statement to the Council's communications channel, not a press conference because this was not the moment for theater, explaining that humanity had filed a formal procedural objection and inviting the Council to a structured dialogue. The statement was 9 sentences long. Each sentence had been reviewed by 6 people. The response came in 48 hours. It was courteous, slightly warm in the way that powerful institutions are warm when they are confident in their position, and informed humanity that the procedural objection had been received and would be reviewed by the appropriate committee within the next 2 standard cycles, approximately 4 Earth months. 4 months, during which Directive 7-441C would remain in effect. Tariq brought her the response with a cup of tea and the expression of a man who has confirmed a suspicion he was hoping to be wrong about. "They're going to wait us out," he said. "They think so," Priya said. "Should I draft the follow-up petition?" "Yes. But that's not the most important thing happening right now." She looked at her secondary display, which was running an analysis sheet commissioned 3 weeks ago from a team of economists, systems engineers and diplomatic historians. Not a secret, there was nothing secret about it, but not advertised either. The most important thing right now is the review. The review was what Priya had actually meant on the call with Okafor 12 days ago, when she talked about asking different questions. It was a systematic examination of every material relationship between humanity and the Galactic Council ecosystem. Trade protocols, technology exchange agreements, navigation rights and the infrastructure they depended on, scientific collaboration frameworks, communication networks. The question behind all the other questions was simple. What does membership actually cost and what does it actually provide? The preliminary findings came back in stages. The first stage was communications infrastructure. Dr. Sione Taufa had been head of the Seoul Interstellar Communications Office for 8 years. He was the kind of expert who had a gift for translating deeply technical realities into terms that decision-makers could act on, and when he briefed Priya by secure channel from his facility on Titan, he did exactly that. The Council's relay network currently handles about 62% of our long-range interstellar communication capacity, he said, sharing a visual that showed humanity's communication architecture as a web of nodes. "We use it because it's there and it's cheap. We pay a nominal access fee and we benefit from the infrastructure that older civilizations built over centuries." "But," Priya said. "But." He highlighted a cluster of nodes on the far edge of the display. "Over the past 8 years, we've been building our own relay infrastructure, mostly for redundancy purposes. It's not a complete independent network, yet. But we're further along than most people realize, including, I think, most people on the Council." He paused. "If we committed additional resources to accelerating that build-out, and I mean meaningful resources, not marginal additions, we could have an independent communication network capable of handling all our current interstellar communication needs in approximately 14 months. Priya looked at the display for a moment. "That's faster than I expected. We've been doing the work. We just weren't doing it urgently." He looked at her steadily through the screen. "I'm not recommending anything. I'm just telling you what the technical reality is. That's what I need," she said. The navigation review came next, delivered by Admiral Constance Breckenridge from the combined Seoul fleet in a briefing that was, in Priya's estimation, one of the most consequential documents produced by any human institution in the previous decade. The short version was this. The Council maintained a network of navigational reference points, effectively, extremely precise spatial landmarks distributed across a significant volume of the galaxy, that all member civilizations used for interstellar navigation. Access to this network was a foundational benefit of Council membership. Without it, interstellar travel was not impossible, but it was significantly slower and less precise. Humanity had been using the network as a matter of course, since the early days of its interstellar program. The assumption, reasonable at the time, had been that access was tied to membership and membership was secure. Admiral Breckenridge's review documented something that nobody had formally written down before, because nobody had felt the need to, humanity had, over the past 2 decades, been independently mapping the local galactic neighborhood using its own survey vessels. The data was distributed across 17 different research institutions and had never been compiled into a unified navigational framework, because there had never seemed to be a reason to do so. There was a reason now. If we aggregate the existing survey data and fill in the gaps, which we know how to do, we have vessels capable of doing it. It's primarily a resource allocation question. We're looking at 18 months to a complete independent navigational framework covering everything within 60 light-years of Sol. 90% coverage within 24 months. What's the resource cost? Priya asked. Significant. Not prohibitive. The bigger cost is time, specifically, the time of the survey personnel and the commitment of assets that currently have other assignments. She paused. But Ambassador, I want to be clear about something. The Council's navigational network is genuinely good. It's the product of thousands of years of accumulated survey work. There is real value in having access to it. I'm not saying independence is better in every dimension. I'm saying it's achievable, and that changes the nature of the relationship. It changes the nature of the leverage, Priya said. Yes. Precisely. The most surprising review was the one that came from Dr. Fatou Diallo's economic modeling team. Priya had expected the trade analysis to show deep interdependence. Humanity was, after all, a younger civilization, and the assumption embedded in the Council's entire tiering framework was that younger civilizations needed the economic gravity of older ones. The analysis told a more complicated story. Humanity exported to the Council ecosystem refined biological compounds unavailable elsewhere in the local cluster, a range of manufacturing techniques developed for low-gravity environments that had proved more efficient than comparable Velhari methods, and, this one genuinely surprised Priya, a class of mathematical modeling frameworks developed for climate and epidemiological prediction that had turned out to have significant applications in galactic-scale logistics. 3 of the major Council members were using human-developed modeling software, under license, to manage their own interstellar supply chains. They depend on us more than the membership framework acknowledges, Diallo said when she presented the findings. Not equally, there's no question that the aggregate economic flow still favors older Council members. But the relationship is not one of dependent child and self-sufficient parent. It's a genuine exchange, and some of what we provide is genuinely difficult to replace. What happens if that exchange is disrupted? Priya asked. For them? Diallo considered. Significant inconvenience in several sectors. Nothing existential. But, significant. The modeling frameworks alone would take years to replicate. For us. More complex. We'd lose access to certain raw materials, certain energy infrastructure, certain technologies. Most of it replaceable within 5 to 10 years. Some of it longer. She paused. But here's the thing, Ambassador. The Council's value proposition to humanity has always been framed as us needing them. And that's true in some domains. But what this analysis shows is that they've been quietly benefiting from us at the same time, and that benefit has never been formally acknowledged or fairly priced. We've been paying market access fees based on a framework that treats us as a dependent, while providing goods and services that a non-dependent trading partner would charge considerably more for. Priya looked at the numbers for a long time. How long before I can have a full economic model of what genuine peer-to-peer trade terms would look like for humanity? 2 weeks, Diallo said. I need it in 10 days. By the end of the second month after Directive 7-441C, Priya had a document on her desk, not a formal policy, not a public statement, not a petition, a private strategic assessment produced for Secretary General Okafor and the senior leadership of humanity's interstellar affairs infrastructure. It was called simply Options. It ran to 60 pages. It did not recommend any particular course of action. It mapped the terrain, technical, economic, diplomatic, of humanity's actual position in the galaxy, stripped of the assumptions that had been embedded in 40 years of carefully managed first contact optimism. The terrain was different from what most people believed. More capable. More self-sufficient. More consequential to others than the Council's tiering framework acknowledged. Not ready for everything. Not without vulnerabilities. Not without genuine reasons to want cooperative relationships with older civilizations. But not, as it turned out, dependent. Not in the way the Council had assumed. Not in the way that made the logic of advisory observer status make any sense. The last line of the assessment read, "The question is no longer whether humanity can act independently. The question is what kind of independence we want, pursued at what pace and toward what end." Priya sent it to Geneva on a quiet Wednesday afternoon. Then she drafted the next formal petition to the council, the third one, careful and precise and fully documented, and filed it on schedule. The record was still being built. That was still important. But the record was beginning to contain different information than it had before. The decision to accelerate the relay network came from an unlikely direction. It wasn't Priya who pushed it. It wasn't Secretary General Okafor. It was a 31-year-old engineer named Kwame Asante at the Outer Sol Relay Facility on Pluto's moon Charon, who sent a technical brief to his department head at 11:30 on a Friday with a subject line that read, "Redundancy is a policy question, not a technical one." The brief made a simple argument. The existing relay expansion work had been scoped as a backup system, the kind of infrastructure you build hoping you never need to rely on it exclusively. That scope had driven conservative decisions about antenna spacing, transmission bandwidth, and processing architecture. But the backup assumption was load-bearing in ways that weren't obvious. If you changed the assumption, if you scoped the network as a primary system from the beginning, the engineering was different. More expensive up front, but dramatically more capable. And the lead time to operational capacity dropped from 14 months to 8. The brief traveled up 3 levels of management in 72 hours. By the end of the following week, it was on Priya's desk with a recommendation letter signed by 4 of the 5 senior members of Humanity's Space Infrastructure Council. The 5th member had abstained, not in disagreement, but because he wanted the record to show that the decision had been made with clear eyes. "We should be honest about what we're doing," he'd written in a note attached to the brief. "This isn't routine redundancy planning. This is infrastructure for a more independent future. That's the right decision to make. We should make it as a decision, not package it as engineering." Priya agreed with him. She appreciated the precision. She approved the funding reallocation on a Thursday morning, flagged it in Humanity's public infrastructure budget as exactly what it was, an accelerated expansion of the independent relay network, and moved on to the navigation review. The council, she noticed, sent no communication about it. The navigation survey initiative was different in character from the relay network. The relay work was largely invisible to the public, a technical program managed by specialists, noticed mainly by those already paying attention. The navigation survey was harder to keep quiet because it required ships. Visible, detectable ships moving through space that other civilizations also moved through. Admiral Breckenridge had proposed an approach she called conspicuous normalcy, conducting the expanded survey program exactly as Humanity conducted all its scientific and exploratory missions, with full public disclosure, standard notifications to the Council's traffic coordination system, and no attempt to obscure the program's scope or purpose. "We are entitled to map space," she told the planning session. "We've been entitled to it from the beginning. We've been doing it for decades. What we're doing now is being more systematic about it. If anyone asks, that's exactly what we'll tell them." And when they ask why, one of the mission planning officers asked, "Because systematic knowledge of our local neighborhood is a prerequisite for autonomous navigation capability, which is an entirely reasonable thing for a spacefaring civilization to develop. We don't need a more sophisticated explanation than that." The survey program launched in the 4th month after the directive, deploying 9 additional vessels to the existing survey fleet. The work was real work, scientifically valuable, carefully designed, not a cover for anything. The data was shared with the global scientific community and archived in open databases. When the Council's Navigation Coordination Office sent a routine query asking for clarification on the expanded survey scope, Humanity's Space Affairs Office replied with a detailed technical summary, accurate and complete, explaining exactly what the vessels were doing and why. The response from the Council was a formal acknowledgement. Nothing more. The technology review produced the most immediately actionable findings, and also the ones that required the most internal debate. The situation was this. Humanity had over 30 years of engagement with the Council ecosystem, acquired access to a range of technologies from older civilizations. The most significant of these fell into 4 categories: medical, energy, materials, and computational. Humanity had integrated several of these into its own technological base, adapted them, in some cases meaningfully improved upon them. The economic analysis Diallo's team had done was partly built on this foundation. What the technology review documented was the degree to which this integration had been managed under terms that still reflected the original membership framework, terms drafted when Humanity was genuinely a novice partner, learning from more experienced neighbors. Those terms had not been updated. They had not been updated because nobody had requested an update, and nobody had requested an update because the existing terms felt like a reasonable price for access to superior technology. The question the review asked was whether, given what humanity had since developed on its own and in collaboration with council partners, those terms still reflected a genuine value exchange. The answer was clearly no. Not dramatically, not dishonestly, the technology access had been and remained genuinely valuable. But the terms included structural provisions that made sense for an early-stage dependent partner and didn't make sense for a civilization that was now contributing meaningfully to the technological ecosystem it was part of. Provisions like the requirement to submit all derivative research for council review before publication, and the clause that gave council-affiliated institutions right of first access to any novel human technological development. These provisions had been accepted in good faith. They had been structured in a way that made them feel like formalities. Looking at them now, through the clear lens of the options document, they were not formalities. "We want to renegotiate," Priya told the technology law team. "Not repudiate, renegotiate. We want terms that reflect what we actually are now, not what we were perceived to be 40 years ago." "The council may not agree to new terms," the lead legal advisor said. "I know. We prepare for that eventuality. But we start with the request." The request was formally submitted in month 5. The council's response came in 3 weeks, faster than any previous communication on the directive dispute, which was itself informative. It was warm, appreciative of humanity's contributions to the technological exchange ecosystem, and declined to renegotiate the existing terms on the grounds that stability of the framework was important for all member civilizations. Priya read the response, noted its speed, noted its tone, and filed it in the annex. Then she asked Dr. Adesanya to begin drafting a formal notice of intent to request independent arbitration under Article 14 of the original membership charter, a provision that allowed any member civilization to request review of specific treaty terms by a panel that included representatives from civilizations not party to the dispute. It was a slow process. It was supposed to be slow. But slow, Priya had come to understand, was not the same as stalled. Slow done right built foundations that didn't wash away. The public didn't know most of this. That was a deliberate choice, and it was occasionally a contested one. Several members of humanity's legislature had been pressing for more transparency, more publicly expressed outrage, more visible confrontation. They were not wrong to want accountability. But Priya had argued, and Okafor had agreed, that the most important work happening right now was not symbolic. It was structural. And structural work done in the glare of daily news cycles had a tendency to become about something other than the actual structure. "We will be fully transparent," Okafor said in a press briefing that carefully addressed the directive and the objections and the ongoing dialogue with the council, without mentioning the relay network acceleration or the navigation survey expansion or the technology renegotiation. "We are pursuing every formal channel available to us. We are documenting everything. This process takes time because real processes take time. We are not being passive. We are being patient because patience is what this moment requires." It was, Priya thought, a genuinely accurate statement. The infrastructure work continued. The survey ships moved through the dark. The legal teams drafted and filed and built the record. And in the quiet of the Sharon facility, Kwame Asante's team ran the new relay architecture through its test sequences for the 3rd time, watching the signal propagation patterns bloom across their displays in clean, unbroken threads. Independent, reliable, entirely their own. 8 months to operational capacity. They were going to make 7. The call from Ambassador Seth Vora surprised Priya. Not that Seth Vora called, the Keth ambassador and she had maintained a professional relationship for 3 years, and since the directive they had spoken frequently about coordinating the Tier 3 response. What surprised her was the content of the call, and the careful, slightly uncertain quality in Seth Vora's voice that she had never heard before. The Keth were a methodical people. They did not express uncertainty lightly. "There is something I need to share with you," Seth Vora said, "which I have discussed with my leadership and which they have authorized me to transmit. It is not comfortable information." "Those are usually the important kind," Priya said. "One of our council liaison staff has a relationship with a Velhari administrative official. A professional relationship of long standing. In the course of normal contact, this official made a comment that our liaison did not fully understand at the time, but which has since been assessed by our analytical division." Seth Vora paused. The comment indicated that the Council's expectation following Directive 7-441C was that the Tier 3 civilizations would file objections, register formal displeasure, and then, in the term the official used, which translates approximately as settle into the new arrangement, accept advisory observer status within 2 or 3 standard cycles. Priya absorbed this. They expected compliance. They expected eventual compliance. They expected objections. What they did not expect was another pause, careful, sustained, organized, multi-track response. Our analytical division believes, based on several subsequent signals, that the pace and sophistication of humanity's response in particular has been noted. There is discussion within the Council's inner deliberative bodies about the appropriate response to your renegotiation request and your Article 14 petition. What kind of discussion? The kind that indicates genuine uncertainty about outcome. Which is unusual. Sethvora's tone carried something that Priya, after a moment, recognized as a form of professional respect. You have created a situation where the expected outcome is not certain. That is not a small thing to create. We're still advisory observers, Priya said. Yes. But the situation is no longer settled. That is different from where it was. The Amari sent their own signal 2 weeks later, through different channels and in their characteristically indirect fashion. A research collaboration proposal, technically routine, but attached to an economic framework document that Diallo's team identified as carefully designed to begin establishing a trade relationship that didn't depend on council-mediated terms. The Velundi were quieter. The Velundi were always quieter. But their technical liaison had requested access to humanity's open-source navigation survey data 3 times in a month, which was not how the Velundi usually requested things they wanted. The Tier 3 civilizations were not coordinating formally. They had no treaty, no agreement, no shared institutional structure. What they had was parallel understanding, the recognition, arrived at independently, that their situations were structurally similar, that the tools available to address those situations overlapped, and that what each of them did was watched by the others. This was not an alliance. It was something more interesting and potentially more durable, a quiet convergence of assessment. Priya had a conversation in month 6 that she thought about for a long time afterward. Her interlocutor was Velsaran, the senior Velhari diplomatic advisor assigned to monitor the Tier 3 response, a civilization ally ancient being whose species had been spacefaring for longer than modern humans had existed, and who conducted themselves with the particular kind of patient authority that comes from having been consistently the most capable entity in almost every room they'd entered for millennia. The meeting had been requested by the Velhari. The agenda, as stated, was a general review of the ongoing dialogue process. What Velsaran actually opened with was a question. Ambassador Vasanthakumar, I would like to understand something about human decision-making, if you would be willing to help me. The translation came through her earpiece in slightly formal English, the way the Velhari's translation technology always sounded, accurate, precise, somehow slightly formal. When your civilization became aware that its formal representation had been modified, the response we observed was not primarily emotional or symbolic. It was analytical, structural. You examined the architecture of your relationships rather than their surface texture. This is not the response we have historically observed from civilizations at this stage of integration. I am curious about the thinking behind it. It was, Priya recognized, a genuinely meant question. Velsaran was curious. Not strategically curious, actually uncertain about something. She considered her answer carefully. I think, she said, it's partly a function of how humanity thinks about problems. We have a long history of situations where the obvious, emotionally satisfying response made things worse. We've had to learn to distinguish between what feels important and what is important, between the signal and the noise. When we received Directive 7-441C, the emotionally satisfying response would have been a very public, very forceful expression of outrage. And there was outrage. I'm not pretending otherwise. But the people responsible for our response asked a different question first. What is actually happening and what does it mean for our actual position? Velsaran was quiet for a moment. In Velhari communication, silence was meaningful. It indicated processing, not discomfort. Your actual position, Velsaran said slowly, appears to be more substantial than the framework anticipated. Yes, Priya said. We believe so. This creates a situation that is, another pause, not what was intended by the directive. No. I imagine not. Priya kept her voice entirely neutral. For what it's worth, we didn't intend the situation either. We intended to respond honestly to circumstances. Where that response leads depends on decisions that haven't been made yet, by us and by the Council. What would you consider a satisfactory resolution? Velsaran asked. Restoration of full voting rights, renegotiation of technology terms to reflect current conditions, and a structural review process to ensure that tier classifications reflect actual capabilities and contributions rather than age of membership. She had said this before in formal documents, but saying it directly to a senior Velhari advisor felt different. More grounded. These aren't new requests. We've submitted them formally. We're still waiting for substantive engagement. There are members of the Council who feel that full voting rights for Tier 3 civilizations creates procedural instability, Velsaran said. It was a diplomatic statement, not quite an argument. There are members of humanity's legislature who feel that advisory observer status for a civilization that has been a member for 40 years, has met all membership obligations, and provides demonstrable value to the Council ecosystem reflects something other than good faith engagement with partners, Priya said. Equally diplomatic. Equally not quite an argument. The silence between them was comfortable in a strange way. I will convey this conversation to the appropriate deliberative bodies, Velsaran said at last. I cannot predict outcomes. I appreciate the candor, Priya said. After the call ended, she sat for a while and thought about what had just happened. A Velhari senior advisor had asked her to explain human thinking, had used the word curious, had acknowledged in careful diplomatic language that the situation was not what was intended. That was not capitulation. That was not even progress precisely. But it was something she hadn't seen before. It was the Velhari looking at humanity and seeing something they hadn't expected to see. She wrote a one-page summary of the conversation and sent it to Okafor. Then she added it to the annex. Month 7. The independent relay network passed its operational threshold test. Kwame Asante's team, which had been working 22-hour cycles for the past 3 weeks, sent a transmission confirmation that traveled from Sharon to the Inner Soul System Relay Hub, through the new independent infrastructure, and arrived with a signal quality index of 99.4, marginally better than the Council network average. It was the kind of engineering milestone that, in normal circumstances, would get a brief mention in the technical press and a congratulatory message from the relevant ministry. Instead, Priya learned about it through a quiet message from Sione Taufa that simply said, "It works. Fully operational. We don't need the Council network for anything critical anymore. Still using it, no reason not to, it's good infrastructure, but we don't need it." She read it twice. Then she wrote back, "Thank you. Please ensure the technical documentation is complete and archived." She did not celebrate. There was nothing to celebrate yet. The relay network was a capability, not an outcome, and the outcome still depended on conversations that hadn't concluded. But she noted, in the private document she kept for herself rather than for the annex, that something had shifted. 40 years ago, humanity had entered the galactic community as a student, grateful and uncertain, learning the rules of a very old game. 10 years ago, it had been a steady participant, competent and consistent, still fundamentally operating within a framework that others had designed. Now it was something else. Not powerful in the way the Velhari were powerful, that took millennia of accumulation. But capable. Independent in the ways that mattered. Clear about what it wanted and why. The game hadn't ended. The negotiation was ongoing. The Council's review committee still hadn't delivered a substantive response to the formal objections. But the board looked different than it had before. Humanity was still at the table. But it was sitting there differently, not because it was angry, not because it was making demands, but because it had done the work that makes the difference between a seat held by grace and a seat held by standing. Those, it turned out, were not the same thing. The Council's formal response to humanity's procedural objections arrived in month 9. It was, by any measure, a significant document, 82 pages, drafted by the Council's Legal Affairs Bureau, citing 217 precedents from the accumulated record of 4,000 years of interstellar governance. Priya read it in one sitting with coffee in the early hours of a Wednesday morning, and emerged from it with 2 distinct impressions. The first was that it was genuinely well argued. The Council's lawyers were not performing skill, they had it. The document engaged seriously with each of the 7 procedural violations documented in Humanity's Annex, addressed each one with historical context and legal reasoning, and arrived at a carefully constructed position, that the Council had acted within its authority, that the process had met the substantive requirements of the Charter even if it had not met every procedural formality, and that Directive 7-441, therefore stood. The second impression was that the document had been written under pressure. Not obvious pressure. Nothing as visible as haste or inconsistency, but a particular kind of pressure that shows up in the way arguments are constructed. The Council's lawyers had worked very hard to make a strong case. Strong cases don't always need to be worked hard at. She forwarded it to Adesanya without comment. Adesanya's response came back in 4 hours. They conceded 3 of the 7 procedural points implicitly. They didn't address the Article 14 petition at all. I need 48 hours, then I want to meet. The meeting happened 50 hours later, with the full legal team assembled in the secure conference space aboard Meridian Station. Adesanya presented her analysis in the methodical way she presented everything. Sequence by sequence, building a structure before naming what the structure was. The implicit concessions were real. 2 of them were minor, procedural formalities that the council acknowledged hadn't been followed, framing them as administrative oversights. The third was more significant. In defending the process by which the directive had been drafted, the council's document had introduced a new characterization of Tier 3 status that was narrower than the original definition, effectively narrowing the scope of what the classification could be used to justify. It was a subtle move, and Priya suspected it had been deliberate, a strategic concession of a minor point to protect a larger one. They're negotiating through their legal response, Adesanya said. They're signaling that there are terms they can work with. But they need to maintain the position that the directive was valid, because conceding that would have implications for the other 11 Tier 3 designations historically. What about the Article 14 petition? Priya asked. Silence is telling. They don't want arbitration. An arbitration panel would include civilizations not invested in the outcome. The Sahari, the Urendi, and the council can't predict that panel's reading of the record. Adesanya paused. They want to settle this bilaterally. Then they need to offer something worth settling for, Priya said. The offer came 3 weeks later, through back-channel diplomatic contact rather than formal communication, itself a signal that the council was being careful about what went on record. The terms were, humanity's restoration to full voting status, contingent on a 5-year probationary period during which voting rights could be suspended if humanity's positions were assessed as destabilizing to the deliberative framework. Technology terms would be reviewed but not renegotiated. The Article 14 petition would be withdrawn as a condition of the agreement. Priya read the terms, passed them to her team, received their assessments and thought about them for 2 days. Then she wrote a response that was 3 paragraphs long and politely declined. Not everything. The framework of bilateral resolution was acceptable, but the specific terms were not. The probationary clause was a reclassified version of the same problem. It made voting rights conditional in a way that full membership status didn't permit. Technology renegotiation was non-negotiable, not as a punitive measure, but because the existing terms were genuinely inaccurate reflections of the current relationship. The Article 14 petition would remain active. Withdrawing it in exchange for negotiated terms would undermine its function as a legitimate mechanism for future disputes. She proposed alternative terms: immediate restoration of full voting rights, no probationary period, a formal working group to renegotiate technology access terms within 12 months, and suspension, not withdrawal, of the Article 14 petition pending good faith progress on the working group. The response from the Council took 11 days. The proposal is under review by the relevant committees. This was the hardest part. Not the waiting. Priya had made peace with waiting long ago. The hard part was holding the line in the face of pressure that came not from the Council, but from inside. 3 members of the International Oversight Committee were publicly calling for humanity to accept the Council's terms as pragmatic. 2 senior diplomats who had been part of first contact protocols argued in an influential journal that the back-channel negotiation represented meaningful progress and that demanding full terms risked damaging the relationship. A former Secretary General gave an interview in which he suggested that humanity's aggressive posture was counterproductive. None of these people were wrong in a simple sense. There were real risks. Relationships were real. The Council's goodwill, or at least its non-hostility, had genuine value. And it was possible, in ways that Priya took seriously, that she was miscalibrating the moment. She had a long call with Okafor about this. "Tell me what you actually think," Okafor said. "I think the offer they made is structurally identical to the original problem," Priya said. "Not in form. The form is better, full voting rights is the right language. But the probationary clause is the same logic, that our participation is conditional on their assessment of our behavior. And I think accepting that now would teach them exactly the wrong lesson. It would teach them that if they wait, we'll settle. And if we're wrong? If we push and they give us nothing and we're advisory observers for another decade. Then we're advisory observers with an independent communications network, a navigational framework 60% complete, renegotiated trade terms with the Keth and Amari, and a formal arbitration request pending that has real legal merit." She paused. That's a worse outcome than what we'd accept from the council. But it's not a catastrophic one. And it's honestly better than being full voting members on terms that allow the other party to remove that status whenever our votes create friction. Okafor was quiet for a moment. You know what the difference is between a diplomat and a strategist? Tell me. A diplomat worries about the relationship. A strategist worries about the position. We need both right now, which means we need you to be right. Pause. I'm behind you. Keep going. The navigation survey hit 70% coverage in month 11. Breckenridge sent the update with a tactical note. At current pace, 90% coverage would be achieved in month 14, 2 months ahead of the original revised estimate. The survey data had also turned up 3 previously uncharted gravitational anomalies that were scientifically interesting in their own right, and which 2 of humanities university research programs had immediately begun publishing papers about. Knowledge, collected independently, generated its own momentum. The Technology Arbitration Working Group request, filed separately from the council-level negotiations, had received a response from the Sahari, one of the older council civilizations not directly involved in the Tier 3 dispute, expressing interest in serving as an arbitration facilitator. The Sahari were respected across the council ecosystem. Their interest in the role was not nothing. Priya kept building. In month 12, the council came back with revised terms. No probationary clause. Full voting rights immediate. Technology Working Group 12-month timeline, with a Sahari-facilitated arbitration mechanism available if the working group reached impasse. Article 14 petition suspended pending working group progress, with an automatic trigger for reactivation if the working group produced no substantive outcome within 18 months. Priya read the terms with the same careful attention she gave everything. Then she read them again. She called Adesanya first. Is there anything here we should be concerned about? Adesanya had clearly already read them. One ambiguity in the working group mandate, the phrase, mutual agreement on technology classifications could be read narrowly. I want that tightened. Otherwise, these are the terms we asked for. They are, Priya agreed. She called Tariq. Your read. 14 months of work, he said quietly. And they got there. We got there, she said. We didn't get here by accident. No, we didn't. She drafted the acceptance, carefully resolving the one ambiguity Adesanya had flagged, and submitted it for Okafor's review and signature. It was accepted as submitted. The public announcement was made on a Thursday. It was factual and brief. Humanity's full voting rights had been restored, a technology working group had been established, the framework for ongoing engagement had been clarified. Okafor gave a press conference. She was measured and gracious, acknowledged the council's willingness to engage, thanked the diplomatic teams, said what needed to be said. Priya watched it from Meridian Station and thought about something Adesanya had said in one of their early meetings, back when the annex was still being assembled. The record is the argument. If the record is right, the argument makes itself. The record had been made. The argument had made itself. Not perfectly, the technology working group still had 12 months of difficult negotiation ahead, and the council's structural dynamics hadn't changed, and there would be future conflicts because future conflicts were simply what happened when different civilizations with different interests shared a deliberative space. But the terms of engagement had shifted. Permanently, Priya believed, not because the council had changed but because humanity had. Because it had looked clearly at what it needed, and what it was prepared to do, and had acted from that clarity rather than from the comfortable assumption that the framework around it was fixed. She turned from the screen showing Okafor's press conference and looked out the viewport at the stars. The relay network was fully operational. The navigation survey was 70% complete. The trade relationships with the Keth and the Amari were running on terms that neither depended on nor deferred to council mediation. None of those things were undone by the restoration of voting rights. They were not contingency plans that became irrelevant when the main plan worked. They were the main plan, the foundation of a position that meant something, that could withstand pressure, that didn't depend on the goodwill of others to remain viable. The council had tried to limit humanity's voice. It had not, as a result, gotten a quieter humanity. It had gotten a clearer one. The technology working group met for the first time in a conference facility aboard a neutral station operated by the Sahari, halfway between Sol and Velhari Prime. Humanity sent 7 people. 3 lawyers, 2 economists, and 2 engineers. The delegation was led by Dr. Adesanya, who had spent 14 months building the legal architecture of the negotiation and who approached the opening session the way a master carpenter approaches a joint that has to bear weight, quietly, methodically, without drama. The council sent 9. The difference in numbers was not accidental, but neither side acknowledged it. What followed was not the story of a dramatic confrontation, or of hidden hostility suddenly surfacing, or of either side attempting to deceive the other. It was more interesting than that. It was the story of two parties who had spent decades operating under the same framework and now, for the first time, had to agree on what that framework actually meant. The first 3 sessions were spent on definitions. This was not unusual in complex negotiations. In Priya's experience, most negotiations were actually about definitions, with everything else following downstream once those were established. The question at issue was deceptively simple. What counted as a derivative technology and what counted as an independent development? The existing terms used both phrases but defined neither. This had been, Dr. Adesanya's team had documented in exhaustive detail, a consistent source of ambiguity that had systematically worked against humanity's interests, because ambiguity in the absence of enforcement mechanisms tends to resolve in favor of the party with more institutional authority to interpret it. The Council's delegation proposed definitions. Humanity's delegation analyzed them. Humanity's delegation proposed counter-definitions. The Council analyzed those. The Sahari facilitators, with elegant patience, helped each side articulate what underlying interest each definition was meant to protect. By the end of Session 4, there was an agreed framework for definitions. It was not everything humanity had wanted. It was substantially better than what had existed before. The session on publication rights was the most contested. The Council's existing terms required that all derivative research be submitted for Council review before publication. Humanity's position was that this constituted a de facto prior restraint on scientific communication, inconsistent with the information-sharing principles that the Council's own charter articulated as foundational values. The Council's delegation's position was that the review process was a coordination mechanism, not a censorship mechanism. Its purpose was to ensure that publications were flagged to relevant parties who might have related research underway, preventing duplicated effort and missed collaboration opportunities. Priya, following the session via secure transcript, noticed something in the third exchange between the delegations. The Council's lead negotiator had used the phrase "we have generally found that review periods of less than 30 days are sufficient." Present tense, a descriptive claim, not a procedural defense. She sent a message to Adesanya. They're not defending the mechanism. They're negotiating the timeline. Adesanya's response came back in 40 seconds. Noted. Adjusting approach. By the end of the session, the parties had agreed in principle to a modified framework. Pre-publication notification, not submission for approval, to relevant Council parties, with a 10-day window for parties to request voluntary coordination discussions. Humanity retained full publication rights. The Council retained the ability to facilitate coordination. Neither side got everything. Both sides got the core of what they actually needed. The energy access terms took 4 sessions. The computational framework licensing took 2 sessions and produced an agreement that, when Diallo's team modeled its economic implications, suggested that humanity's licensing fees for its predictive modeling software would approximately triple under the new terms, reflecting the genuine market value of tools that the Council ecosystem had been accessing at what now appeared to have been a subsidized rate. The last session addressed a provision that had not been on the original agenda. It was the Council's delegation that raised it, during a quiet moment in the closing discussions of Session 11. Their lead negotiator, a Velhari legal specialist named Voresin who had been methodical and fair throughout, set aside the day's planned agenda item and said something that Priya, watching the transcript, found herself reading 3 times to be certain she understood it correctly. My delegation wishes to raise a matter that is not formally on the agenda, but which we believe is relevant to the spirit of this process. Voresin paused. The classification framework that places humanity in Tier 3 status was developed before humanity's full participation in the Council ecosystem and has not been updated to reflect the current reality of that participation. We are not in a position in this working group to resolve that classification. But we wish to state for the record that this delegation considers the question a legitimate one, and one that our Council colleagues should engage with through the appropriate processes. Adesanya had looked up from her notes when she heard this. She'd kept her expression professional. After the session she sent Priya one line. They said it themselves. They put it in the record. Priya read it. Set down her tablet. Looked out the viewport. The record. Adesanya had been right about the record from the beginning. Built carefully, honestly, over 14 months, it had acquired weight that went beyond any single negotiation. It had become the kind of thing that other parties, even the ones with more institutional power, had to acknowledge. The working group concluded in month 14 with a comprehensive revised framework, Sahari authenticated, filed as a formal amendment to humanity's original membership agreement. It was not celebrated as a victory. Priya had discouraged that framing in every conversation she had about it, and she meant it. It wasn't a victory. Victories had losers, and the goal had never been to defeat the council or to humiliate it, or to extract concessions through force. The goal had been to be recognized as what humanity actually was. A participant whose contributions deserved honest valuation, whose voice deserved genuine hearing, whose interests deserved real consideration alongside everyone else's. That was what had been achieved. Not more, not less. Secretary-General Okafor gave another press conference. This one was more detailed than the one about voting rights. She walked through the major provisions of the revised framework, in language clear enough for a general audience to understand what had changed and why it mattered. She answered questions with the careful directness that had become the hallmark of her tenure. One journalist asked, "What would you say to the argument that humanity should have been more aggressive earlier? That we could have achieved this faster?" Okafor considered for a moment. "I'd say that we achieved this because of the way we did it. Not despite it." She paused. "We did it by understanding our situation clearly, acting from what we actually were rather than from what we wished we were or feared we were, and building things that would have value regardless of how any specific negotiation turned out. That's not slow. That's careful. Those are different things." The navigation survey reached 90% coverage in month 15, 1 month ahead of the revised schedule. Breckenridge sent the update with a flag noting that the remaining 10% of local neighborhood space, the furthest reaches of the survey zone, would be complete within 90 days. After that, humanity would have an independent navigational framework accurate enough for all operational purposes. Priya replied with 2 sentences, "Excellent work. Please ensure the full dataset is archived and shared openly with the scientific community." She added, in the margin of her private notes document, "We built it because it was the right thing to build. Not to use against anyone. Not as leverage. Because knowing where you are is fundamental to knowing who you are." The relay network was routing approximately 30% of humanity's interstellar communications through independent infrastructure, not because the Council network was inaccessible, but because operational practice on any resilient system required regularly using the backup to keep it functional. Both networks were running, complementary and independent. In Geneva, in the research institutes, in the engineering facilities on Titan and Charon and the navigation survey vessels moving through the dark at the edges of surveyed space, the work continued. Not as emergency response to a crisis, not as contingency preparation for a feared conflict, but as the ordinary, steady accumulation of capability that a mature civilization builds because it intends to remain in the world for a long time. Priya had a late-night conversation with Tariq in month 16, one of those conversations that happens when 2 people have been working through something large together and have arrived, not at an end, but at a natural pause. "Do you think they understand what happened?" he asked. By they he meant the Council. By what happened he meant everything, the full arc of it. Priya thought about Velsaran asking her to explain human thinking. About Voresan placing the classification question in the record. About the speed of the Council's eventual response to her alternative proposal. "I think some of them do," she said. "I think some of them are still processing it. The older civilizations, they're used to being the ones who adapt more slowly. They're not used to being surprised by the pace at which someone else moves. Is that a problem? For the relationship. It might create friction," she said. "It'll probably create friction. But friction between genuine peers is different from the friction of a weaker party pushing against a stronger one. Different quality." She looked at her coffee. "I think we'll have real arguments with the Council in the future. Disagreements about real things that matter. And that's actually more honest than the alternative." "What's the alternative?" "A relationship where one party is so dominant that the other one adjusts to avoid conflict. That feels peaceful. But it's not actually engagement." She set down the cup. "What we have now, it's harder. But it's real." Tariq was quiet for a moment. "For what it's worth," he said, "I think we handled it right." "We handled it carefully," Priya said. "Whether it was right, the full assessment on that takes longer. Maybe a generation." She smiled just slightly. "But I think we pointed in a direction worth heading." A year after Directive 7-441C, Priya was no longer aboard Meridian Station on a permanent basis. The intensity of the post-directive period had required that, the round-the-clock availability, the secure calls at 3 o'clock, the need to be physically present at the junction point of humanity's interstellar diplomatic infrastructure. But with the working group concluded and the new framework operating, she had returned to something closer to normal rhythm. Based partly in Geneva, partly on the station, traveling when travel added something that communication couldn't. She was in Geneva the morning the Amari submitted a formal request for council reclassification review. The document was careful, thorough, and cited as precedent, the Velhari delegation statement in the working group's final session, the statement that had placed the classification question in the official record. It argued that Tier 3 status for the Amari, the Keth, the Valundi, and humanity did not reflect the current contributions and capabilities of those civilizations, and requested a formal review by an independent panel. It cited humanity's Article 14 petition framework as the appropriate procedural model. Priya read it at her desk in Geneva with actual morning coffee this time, and felt something she took a moment to identify. It was not pride exactly. It was something more specific. The recognition that something she had helped build had become a tool that others could use. The record. The framework. The demonstrated precedent that patient, careful, documented engagement could move even very old and powerful institutions. The Amari hadn't copied humanity's approach. They developed their own, adapted to their own situation. But they had looked at what humanity had done and seen a template for what was possible. She called Seth Vora. "You saw the Amari submission," Seth Vora said immediately. "Not a question." "I did." "Are you coordinating with them?" "We were consulted. We express support but are not formally co-filing. Our situations are different enough that separate processes seem appropriate." Pause. "The Valundi have also been in contact. I believe they are preparing their own submission on a slightly different timeline. 3 civilizations, pursuing classification review through formal channels, building on demonstrated precedent. Not a block, not a coordinated campaign, a pattern. The kind of pattern that, once it existed in the record, was very difficult to dismiss as an isolated grievance." "How is the council receiving it?" Priya asked. "Carefully," Seth Vora said, with the Keth equivalent of dry amusement. "Very carefully." The classification review panel was convened 4 months later, with Sahari participation and representation from 2 other senior council civilizations not party to the dispute. Its mandate was to develop an updated framework for tier classifications that reflected demonstrated capabilities, contributions, and the multi-track nature of interstellar engagement in a way the original tiering system had not been designed to capture. Humanity participated as an advisory voice, not because its voting rights had any bearing on the panel's mandate, but because its experience over the previous year was directly relevant to the questions the panel was working through. Priya sent Adesanya and 2 members of the economic modeling team to represent humanity's perspectives. The panel was expected to take 18 months. These things usually did. Meanwhile, the work continued. Not anxiously, not reactively, just the ordinary accumulation of a civilization that had decided what it was building toward. The navigation survey reached full coverage of the target zone in month 17. Admiral Breckenridge issued a technical announcement, dry and factual, noting that the Sol navigation framework was now operational as an independent system capable of supporting all current and projected interstellar navigation requirements without reliance on council infrastructure. The announcement included a sentence noting that the framework data was being made available to all member civilizations as a contribution to the shared cartographic record. That last sentence had been Priya's suggestion. Not as a gesture of generosity, though it was genuine, but as a statement of intent. We built this for ourselves. We are sharing it because that is how you treat neighbors. Both things are true simultaneously. The Sahari requested access within a week. 2 other council civilizations followed. Dr. Adesanya left the working group in month 18 to take a position at the University of Nairobi's new Center for Interstellar Governance, a research institution whose founding had been directly inspired by the documentation work of the post-directive period. The center's mission was to build the analytical tools and precedent frameworks that would help humanity navigate the next 40 years of galactic engagement with the same careful clarity that the last 14 months had required improvising. At her farewell gathering on Meridian Station, she gave a short talk. She was not a person who gave long talks. "What I hope we learned," she said, "is that the record is not just a legal instrument. It is also a kind of memory. It is how a civilization shows itself, over time, who it is. Every document we filed, every analysis we completed, every careful response we sent through proper channels, that is all part of a picture of humanity that will exist in the archives of the galactic community for centuries. We didn't win an argument. We wrote something down. Something that can be referenced, cited, and built on." She paused. "That's worth more than a single victory. If we continue in the same spirit, clear, honest, patient, rigorous, the record will keep making our arguments for us. Priya was in the back of the room. She didn't speak. She just listened and thought about 14 months of work, and the Pluto Relay Network and Velsaran asking her to explain human thinking, and Breckenridge's survey ships moving through the dark. The Classification Review Panel issued its preliminary findings in month 20. The findings were not final. 18 months was an estimate, not a deadline, and the full framework revision would take longer. But the preliminary findings established 3 things that would shape everything that followed. First, the existing tier classifications did not adequately reflect the current capabilities and contributions of several member civilizations, including humanity. Second, a revised classification framework should be based on demonstrated engagement capacity, contribution to the shared knowledge and infrastructure of the Council ecosystem, and capacity for independent action, not on age of membership alone. Third, the review process itself should be a regular, periodic function of the Council's governance structure, not a one-time emergency response. The third finding was, in some ways, the most significant. It institutionalized the principle that the framework was not fixed, that it should be revisited as the community of civilizations changed. That was not a concession extracted under pressure. It was a structural reform that the review panel had arrived at through its own deliberative process, based on evidence. Evidence that included, in the panel's cited documentation, humanity's 14-month record of careful, formal, fully documented engagement. The record. Still working. Priya resigned as ambassador in month 22. Not because things were going badly, they were going as well as she had any right to expect, which was to say, imperfectly but honestly. Not because she was tired, exactly, though 4 years aboard Meridian Station had been demanding in ways that compounded gradually. She resigned because the situation had changed, and the change meant that what was needed next was different from what she had been providing. The post-directive crisis had required a particular combination of legal precision, strategic patience, and structural thinking. That combination had been what Priya did. The next phase, the ongoing negotiation of the revised classification framework, the technology working group's implementation monitoring, the sustained development of independent infrastructure that was now normal operations rather than emergency construction, required institutional durability more than individual intensity. She recommended 3 people for the ambassadorial succession, any of whom could do the job well. Tariq was one of them. She didn't tell him she'd recommended him. Her farewell was quiet. She didn't want the kind of ceremony that turns the work into a story with a hero. The work didn't have a hero. It had a lot of careful people doing careful things over a lot of time. She gave one interview to a long-form science journal whose readership she respected. The journalist asked her what she thought the most important thing was that had happened over the previous 2 years. She thought about it for a while before answering. "I think the most important thing," she said carefully, "is that we stopped pretending the framework was fixed. Not just the Council's framework, our own. We had internalized a story about ourselves as newer, less capable, dependent in important ways on the goodwill and resources of older partners. Some of that story was true. Some of it was just a story." She paused. "When we looked clearly at what was actually true, we found that we were more capable than the story acknowledged, and that the relationship was more genuinely mutual than the formal structure reflected. That clarity, being willing to examine the assumptions, that was the work. Everything else followed from that." "Is humanity safer now?" the journalist asked. Priya considered. "We're more independent. Whether that's the same as safer depends on how you define safety. If safety means being protected by a powerful institution that you depend on, we're less safe in that sense because we depend less and so the protection is less. If safety means having the capability and the position to manage your own interests honestly, yes, I think we're considerably safer." "Is that the kind of safety you were aiming for?" "It's the only kind," she said, "that lasts." 3 years after Directive 7-441C, Kwame Asante received the Seoul Infrastructure Service Medal, humanity's highest civilian engineering honor, for his work on the relay network. He accepted it at a ceremony in Accra with the slightly uncomfortable graciousness of someone who has never been comfortable being recognized publicly for work he still thought of as simply doing the job correctly. In his brief acceptance remarks he said, "We built it because we needed it. And we tried to build it well because things built well last." He paused. "I think that's all we were trying to do." The Classification Review Panel issued its final report in month 26. Under the revised framework, humanity's designation shifted from Tier 3 to the new Category B status, a category that reflected demonstrated multimodal engagement capacity, independent infrastructure development, and substantive contribution to the shared knowledge ecosystem. The three other formerly Tier 3 civilizations received revised designations appropriate to their specific situations. Category B carried the same voting rights as the original full membership. It also, under the new periodic review mandate, created a formal pathway for reclassification toward Category A, the designation currently held by the most senior council members, based on continued development across the assessed dimensions. It was not equality with the Velhari. That was a matter of millennia and accumulated history and the kind of relationships that take generations to build. Priya understood that and had always understood it. But it was something that the original membership framework had not provided. A path. A formal, documented, reviewable path forward, with criteria that reflected what humanity was actually doing and building, rather than how old it was in the eyes of the community it had joined. That was worth 40 years of careful engagement and 14 months of harder work, and the quiet accumulation of capability that would continue long after any individual who had worked for it was gone. On Titan, in the relay facility, the signals moved at the speed of light along pathways that humanity had built for itself. In space, the survey vessels had turned outward, beyond the original 60 light-year zone, beginning the slower, longer work of mapping the wider neighborhood. In Geneva, in the new Center for Interstellar Governance, researchers were building the analytical tools for the next 40 years. At Meridian Station, Tariq Osei, newly confirmed as ambassador, young enough to see considerably more of the century ahead than most of his colleagues, sat in the small galley late in the evening with coffee, and read the latest communication from the council with the careful attention of someone who had been taught that the space between words was where the real meaning lived. Outside the viewport, the stars were what they had always been. But humanity's position among them was its own. Not given. Not borrowed. Not dependent on any other civilization's continuing generosity. Earned, carefully, over years, through the kind of work that doesn't make for dramatic stories but makes for durable ones. The kind that lasts.